Welcome everybody, my name is Suzanne Rose and I'm the Education Outreach Officer for the Mass Observation Archive, and welcome to Everyday Kindness. This is our event in celebration of World Kindness Day, which takes place this weekend. And I'd also like to introduce and welcome Michelle Johansson, who is one of our Mass Observation trustees and also works at the Bishopsgate Institute in London. Michelle has kindly agreed to join me in this event so we can chat about all things kind. And we're going to be exploring kindness in everyday life as captured by mass observation. And I'll be sharing a selection of responses we received to our kindness directive, which was issued last autumn. And Michelle and I are going to have a bit of a chat and then obviously include yourselves as well. So please do post any comments in the chat. There'll be time to ask questions at the end as well. And we really want to hear from you. So please do join in with us. Don't just let us witter away. Please do join in as well and share your experiences of kindness too. I'm going to check and share my slides in a moment, check that everyone can see them. Can you all hear me okay? I have to apologise, you may also hear my chocolate Labrador Django in the background who likes to join in, so there may be occasional bark, but yes, you can hear me, that's great, lovely. Okay, so I'm going to just share my screen and let's share this. Okay, thanks Lindsay, thanks for checking anyway. I'll hopefully be able to let people in at the same time. Let's just see if I can move this around. Okay, this. Right. Can you all, let's see. I'm going to move this down. Can you see my screen? It should have a big MO. Yes. Good. I can still see some of you in the chat. That's great. That's great. Lovely. Okay. And I don't think we've got anyone else waiting. So let's make a start. As I explained, we're going to chat a little bit about Mass Observation's responses to our kindness directive. But I thought to give you some context, I should share some of those responses with you to begin with. So I'm just going to see if I can. There we go. So this is my perhaps my favourite quote about kindness that I came across when I was reading through the directive responses. I'm just going to read it out. Warm, gold, friendly, smiling people. It's light-coloured, gold, yes, but also blue like water. It's watery like the sea. They're also warm like a blanket. And that was from Mass Observer A1706, who is a woman living in Shoreham by Sea. And I just really loved the sense of that, just the feelings it conjured, the fact that kindness can have all of these different dynamics, I suppose, and provide comfort as well. And so I was really wondering what words you might use to describe kindness. In the directive, we asked observers to record the first 10 words that came to mind when they thought of kindness. And I wondered whether you could just post a word in the chat that you think of when you think of kindness. Can you describe what kindness looks like and feels like to you? And say how important kindness is in your life. So this was the first task we asked our observers to do. And I wondered if you might want to have a go and share with us the words that you think of when you think of kindness. Joy, cozy, consideration. These are lovely words. Let's see what else we've got. More coming through. Heartwarming, generous, selfishness, helpful, bright and happy. Lovely. Belonging. Those are really lovely. And how important is kindness to you? Obviously, you've all come along to the Everyday Kindness session, so I'm guessing it probably rates quite highly with you. How important would you say kindness is to you? Key. Yeah. Very, exclamation mark, I like that. Okay. So Abby said, I've tried to think more consciously about it in recent years, so very important. It can make my day. Oh, that's lovely. Ben, not sure how to answer that. It can unnerve me when there is too much of it. It makes me powerful. Okay, well, we'll try not to trigger any tears today, Ben. But I have to say, I mean, from reading through some of the responses over the last sort of year or so, there have been times where I have, I've shed a tear or two myself. It can be quite overwhelming just hearing everyone else's experiences of kindness as much as my own. That's great. Thank you for sharing those. I'm just going to share with you some of the words that our observers came up with, and some of them echo your own. And I just thought it'd be an interesting exercise just to see how your words may chime with theirs. And we've got some very similar ones here. The larger words are the ones that were kind of spoken of more commonly in the responses, and I just could have inputted all the responses into the word cloud. So thoughtful, empathy, help, love, warmth came up an awful lot, I have to say, understanding, quite a few of the ones that you've mentioned as well. And there were lots of other ones around compassion, sympathy, empathy, obviously, smiling, glow, I really like as well. So we'll perhaps revisit this exercise at the end of the session and see if there are any other words that come to mind, but it sounds as though we're all thinking along the same lines when it comes to kindness and what it kind of embodies and evokes for us. So I thought I'd just mention briefly what mass observation is, just for those of you who may be unfamiliar with it, before I go on to share the actual responses we received, just to give them a bit of a context. So it's a social research organisation, and it started in 1937, just before the Second World War, and continues to the present day. And we're a current research project, and we continue to generate new material. And what we're interested in is ordinary people's lives in Britain. So the more ordinary, the better. And we explore all sorts of different aspects and themes that impact on people's daily life. As you might imagine, in the early phase, this is very much looking at life on the home front in Britain during the war years, but mass observation was inherently nosy and asked about all sorts of aspects of people's lives and their feelings, their thoughts, their emotions, their opinions, and really wanted to kind of get under the skin of ordinary people and their everyday lived experience. And we continue to do that, and we continue to be very nosy, and we ask all sorts of questions of our observers. We're an active social research organisation, and we're always responding to world events and commissioning new directives to enable us to grow and record everyday life and grow the collection in response to our lives today, and our materials used by researchers and policymakers, writers and students and ordinary people to better understand everyday life in Britain. We have a panel of observers, of writers who volunteer for us, numbers up to around 500, usually across the country, and they respond to directives, which is the word mass observation gives to open-ended questionnaires, about 3 times a year, and each directive tends to include 2 or 3 different topics. And we collaborate with the researchers who commission these directives, and they provide really rich qualitative material in terms of the responses. Some people write for many, many pages in their responses. And over that period from 1981, when the current project restarted, to the present day, we've had over 5,000 contributors across many, many different themes. It's really, really hard to find a theme that mass observation hasn't covered. These are just a selection of some of the themes that we've covered over the last sort of 40 years or so. Sometimes we're revisiting themes that mass observation covered in the early phase of its research in the 30s to the 50s. And we're interested in how attitudes have changed in that time. Sometimes we look at topics we've covered, and obviously we cover world events, and we always cover royal events, world wars, general elections, politics. There are key events we always cover. We seem to be interested in the weather quite often as well. But then sometimes we look at our list of topics that we explored, and we realise that we've made an omission and we've overlooked something. So a few years ago, we realised we'd never covered the Eurovision Song Contest, which is obviously an absolute travesty. So we quickly issued a directive on the Eurovision. and the results were really, really interesting. But the same thing happened with kindness. We were looking through topics we were covering, and out of our work covering the COVID pandemic, I was noticing more and more people were talking about acts of kindness and recognizing kindness in their daily life. And I thought this would be something that would be really interesting for mass observation to explore. But we'd never explicitly asked about kindness in any of our directives to date. So we realized that was something that we needed to do. And so we set about doing that last year. I've been looking at kindness through the early phase of mass observation, just picking up where it had been mentioned. And I made a short film for KindFest, a festival of kindness that takes place in November each year, last year. And that a clip of that film is on our YouTube channel, which you're very welcome to watch. And that just looks at where kindness has been referenced in mass observation, really in the early phase and some of our more recent directives. But this was prior to us issuing a directive on kindness itself. And then we worked with the University of Sussex Centre for Research on Kindness with Professor Robin Banerjee on actually co-commissioning a directive last autumn in 2021 on kindness, because we thought it was just really, really important that we made sure that we had material on kindness and people explicitly writing about kindness. And we received 149 responses from mass observers, the oldest of whom was a woman born in 1938, so almost as old as the archive itself. And the youngest was a man, a student born in 1996. These writers come from across the UK, really broad geographic spread, broad range of ages, and occupations are very varied as well. Robin Banerjee, Professor Robin Banerjee, described kindness as a golden thread which runs through mass observation. And I think from some of the responses you can really see that, certainly from my research covering both phases of our activity. And we launched the directive last year at KindFest, and I've been looking at the responses really since spring of this year. The directive, as most of our directives do, gives a number of prompts for people to respond to try and frame their thinking on the topic. And we recognise that it's quite a broad topic for people to respond to. In fact, I read one observer's response saying that they'd spend the most amount of time ever considering and thoughtfully responding to this particular topic because the sheer breadth of things that they could write about. But we asked about giving and receiving of kindness. What was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for you? Who was kind for you? What did they do? What impact did that have on your life? We asked about places of kindness, asked people to take us on a tour of the places that they've felt the most kindness in their life. We asked about people and kindness. Do you think that some people are just more kind than other people? And who's the kindest person you know? We also asked their views on kindness today, wanted to know about kindness in society in general, whether they felt that had changed over the course of their lifetime, and does kindness look any different now to how it did perhaps in the past? And then we asked them to project and look forward to future kindness. I wanted to know whether they felt society would be kinder in the future, and what was the single most important thing they might want to change or do in order to make that happen. So a really, really broad directive for people to get stuck into, and people did share an awful lot. And one of the things with our observers is they write anonymously. So where I give code numbers for their responses, that's their observer number. And this anonymity allows them to be really free and open and candid in what they share with us and with everyone else. So people do write very frankly and in great detail about their lives, which is a real privilege for us to receive. So I started looking through all of these responses, and just out of general interest, but also in preparation for doing some more work around kindness leading up to World Kindness Day. I just want to share a small selection. These are just a taste of them with you before Michelle and I have a sort of further chat. But on each of these themes, I've just got a few of the quotes and extracts to share with you. So here we are. These are the responses on receiving and giving kindness. When kindness is meted out to you, particularly when it comes from a stranger, it always feels good, and instances can stay in your memory for the rest of your life. Travelling back from hospital after an operation, I was on the train back from King's Cross, feeling like death, when I opened the drop-down mini table fixed to the back of the seat in front to find an origami heart nestled in there. Some unknown person had made this and left it there for someone else to find. And to me, as rational as any human being you can get, it seemed like a blast of hope coming to me out of the unknown. And that was from J7420, a woman in Knaresborough. And what really struck me about that was that how much it had meant to her. And later on in her response, she says that she still has this origami heart, and it's in a cabinet of curiosities that she's collected over her life. And obviously it's there and it still brings back those feelings. But later on, when I was reading through some other responses, I was really heartened to come across this one from a male writer in Portsmouth who said, "I'm very conscious about doing kind things for others, and the best kindnesses are done possibly for people I will not meet. I often make little origami pockets out of beautiful paper, and last Valentine's Day, in the midst of lockdown, I made lots of red and pink little origami parcels and placed tiny love poems inside them. We went out and secreted them all around Southsea for the people to find. Is this kindness? I mean, I don't have to do it, and I wanted people to feel happy. Whenever I'm in a cafe, I will put a tiny little origami model for someone to find. It may be lost forever, but someone may find it and smile, and then perhaps do the same thing for someone else. I'd like to think that this is the spirit of kindness. So if something I do makes someone smile, then they may think better of the world and be kinder to others." And I just thought, what are the chances that in two responses, obviously in disparate parts of the country, they both reference the joy of finding an origami heart and making them and sharing them with others. And I like the serendipity of that very much. And the next response is somebody reflecting back over 50 years earlier. He said, "I was about 5 years old and I was taken to a bridge that went over a railway near our house. A train went under the bridge and the driver waved at me. It was a tiny thing for him to have done. He probably forgot about it before he finished his shift, but I still get a nice feeling from his act of kindness." So that's some 50 years later, he's still reflecting on that incident, which obviously meant so much to him as a little boy. And the next one on giving and receiving kindness. "One of the kindest things someone ever did to me was to slip their hand into mine when I was telling them about how I could not have biological children. I was telling the daughters of 2 friends of mine about this when they asked why I didn't have children. And as I explained to them, one of them just quietly put their hand in mine and left it there. Nothing was ever said, but that gesture, physical contact, has stayed with me over the past 4 years or so and still blows me away." But in addition to these sort of wonderful moments of kindness that have stayed with people, I have noticed in some of the responses, people having real difficulties with kindness, either expressing it themselves or receiving it from others. And so I just wanted to highlight that a few people who have talked about the difficulties with kindness as well, which I thought was quite interesting in contrast. So this is a man in Glasgow in his 60s. He says, "I have an issue with kindness. I'm suspicious of it, a bit like love. I don't understand what is expected of me. I can't actually remember anyone ever being exceptionally kind to me. So often what people interpret as kindness is actually just serving a need in themselves to make themselves feel good." And similarly, this woman in her 70s expresses difficulties with accepting kindness, perhaps, or giving it, and wondering how it might be accepted. She said, "I've also known occasions when I've intended a kindness which has been misunderstood and rejected, perhaps because I was not trusted, or perhaps because the recipient was too defensive to accept it, and this felt uncomfortable." And finally, I've always felt that I've struggled to see myself as kind, as I'm not a naturally gentle or quiet person. I think this feeling is perpetuated by assumed connections between kindness and mildness. I also feel that kindness is self-effacing, and so to recognise it in yourself is somehow counterintuitive. That was from a woman in West Sussex, and I found that in a number of responses, that people find that if they're very conscious of being kind, it's almost, or they, you know, get any acknowledgement for it, it kind of also sort of undermines the act of kindness in itself, and they feel kind of quite conflicted about this. And this particular person was a naturally extrovert person. She described herself as being very kind of sociable, and she just felt that perhaps, you know, kind people were necessarily more introverted by nature or quieter than her. So somehow she was trying to reconcile these two different aspects of her kind of personality, and she feels that she has lots of empathy to share, but she kind of felt like that, you know, she should be doing that in a kind of perhaps a quieter way. But that was quite an interesting response on the difficulties with kindness. I'm just going to move on to places of kindness. And this woman from Lowestoft is writing, reflecting on her childhood years as a teenager. And she says, from the age of about 11 to 16, my refuge at lunchtimes was my friend's house. I started to have school dinners, but I absolutely hated them. And what was funny about her longer kind of response was that she apparently engineered going to her friend's house to avoid school dinners, but she spent all of her dinner money at the tuck shop buying chocolates and sweets. And her friend's mum had explained that she was very sorry, but she couldn't afford to feed her. The whole family had a cooked lunch dinner at lunchtime, but she couldn't afford to feed her too. But she said she didn't mind because she had her chocolate and she had her sweets. So she sat on their sofa having a lovely time watching TV. And she did this every lunchtime throughout those years, and her mum never found out. And she thought this was wonderful. And it was a really lovely association with her friend's family, their home, and how kind she felt they were to allow her to do that. And her love of chocolate and sweets, which has continued. And the next one is the place that I felt most kindness was my Nana's house in Birkenhead. I visited there a lot during the school holidays, and I always felt that I could do anything, knowing that I would not get into any trouble. There was always love in that house, and I felt safe and secure. And in common with that gentleman, many people have written about their grandparents' homes, and whether it's the association with being with their grandparents, or the feelings that kind of imbued in those homes, or their, you know, reminiscences on their childhood experiences, that many people chose that as their place where they associated most with kindness. And this woman's reflecting on a home that she still lives in. And she said, I've always felt that this house was kind to me, and I love it for that. And although it's an inanimate object, I felt it looked after me at a crossroads in my life. And nearly 18 years later, I'm still here. I think I feel very similarly about my homes. That one chimed with me. I've been in my home nearly 20 years now, and it's seen me through an awful lot. And this lady's reflecting on a different place, a library. She said, the first kindness I can remember as a child in the 1940s was my mother's friend introducing me to the local library. My mother did not read books, and near the end of her life admitted that she'd never actually been in a library. I feel that this person who introduced me to the libraries gave me a lifelong kindness, which has never expired. And I thought that was rather lovely. For those of us who love libraries, I can really relate to that. But then this gentleman had a completely different take on things, and he thought this was a joke question that we'd planted in the directive. He said, I don't think there is any relation between a place where I've been and kindness I felt. Surely kindness can be felt in any place, and it's people who exhibit kindness, not places. One might argue that if you're in a place with more doors, there are more doors to open for people. But I think you could and you should be able to find kindness and its opposite just about anywhere. And he was quite strident in the way that he wrote about places and kindness, which was in contrast to most other people who seemed to have a place that they associated. But actually, looking back through the directives, many of those places were sort of imbued and associated specifically with people in their lives who'd been kind to them as well. And going on to people and kindness, this was really lovely because obviously it was a chance for people to pay tribute to particular people in their lives, and most people chose their loved ones and their family members, to be fair. But this gentleman was reflecting on his grandmother and his relationship with her, and he said, I'd say the kindness, or one of the many kinds of things that my grandmother did for me, will always be evident. I went off the rails as a teenager and ended up in prison for a year. She was a frail-looking, well-spoken woman in her late 70s and insisted on travelling around the various parts of the country to visit me and wrote to me weekly to help me through the worst period of my life. And this woman's writing, and she says, I hope that I'm thought of as kind. If there's one characteristic I would strive to have is kindness. My dad and his mum were particularly kind. My dad's brother is kind. So are my husbands and sons. And I always felt warm and cared for at both sets of grandparents' homes. Not particularly in my own home, as my mother was generally unkind, to be honest. And I was really struck by this honesty. I mean, quite often our writers are very direct and honest with us. She doesn't go on to say anything else about her mother, but I was really drawn into her story and the fact that she was listing so many of these people as kind, and then suddenly, very abruptly, she made this reference to her own mother. And that was quite striking in and of itself. And I wanted to learn more. And quite often you don't quite manage to learn everything you'd like to know from somebody's responses, but I was really taken in by her story. And I particularly like this very brief quote here from a woman in Suffolk who said that I think people gravitate to the like kind. And that gave me some food for thought, really, just thinking about people out there and how like kind we are, and how we find tribes of people who are like us, and maybe they're like us because they're similarly kind, or maybe we're drawn to those qualities in people because they're qualities we recognise in ourselves. And then some reflections on kindness today. There were mixed feelings, I have to say, across the board about kindness today, some more positive than others. I've tried to kind of include a few quotes to kind of give a sort of balanced response. This gentleman, who is a policeman, I believe, in Newhaven, he says that empathy appears to me to be a bedrock of kindness. And it strikes me that empathy is unequally distributed in society. I fear that technology is changing us. And though I would not assert that our use of IT is making us less kind, it's certainly removing the possibility of human interaction and thus the opportunity to be kind. And the next writer is saying, I certainly believe that kindness today has changed and is less common than years ago. In my view, society has become far more selfish for the individual, and often kindness to others is seen as a weakness. Those less wealthy, healthy, different or other are seen as more and more as needing to stand on their own 2 feet. And lastly, on this topic, a kind of contrasting view. I think that it's a rather hackneyed and old conceit to claim that people were kinder in the past and that everyone today is deeply unkind. As a historian who works on war and empire in the late 19th and 20th century, I can think of lots of instances of people being very unkind to each other in the past. I suspect things like social media give greater audience to public acts of unkindness. And I think Michelle and I might pick up on these topics as we chat in a moment, but certainly there was lots of references to social media, internet use, technology, and those sorts of things, and its impact on people's interaction with each other's and the opportunities to be kind or unkind in that kind of more public forum and space. And then finally, just a few words on future kindness. I like this quote because it seemed quite optimistic. It says, kindness smiles, it opens up, it includes, it does not shut out. It feels warm and flows freely. One longs for kindness and one wants the world to be the very world to be kind. I thought that was quite a hopeful, perhaps quite idealistic point of view and perspective. And it was in great contrast to many of the other responses which spoke about climate change, politics, society, technology, and all the other things that people were finding that there needed to be, more kindness in the world to address. I sort of was drawn towards the more personalized accounts of kindness of people sort of wrestling with these big issues and then deciding, well, what could they do to affect any change in their lives or the lives of their communities? What steps could they take to be kinder as individuals, but also to kind of make their bit of society kinder when faced with sort of overwhelming other issues. So the presumption of kindness, if we want some society to be kind in the future, this seems like a good place to start for everyone to start. And this other woman has said that I want kindness to be the most important thing in my life. And for a few years now, I've tried to make a New Year's resolution just to be kind. I have the capacity and time and willingness after all, and I rather believe that after a long and happy and comfortable life, looking at the state of the earth now, that when the chips are down for an awful lot of us, not just the old, and when they are, you're just left with kindness. And finally, this gentleman says, I have one golden rule, that if anyone is kind to me, I pass a kindness on to somebody else. If more people did this in the world would be a nicer place. And he was a locksmith, and he wrote also about how he often let people back into their houses and change their locks for free as well, which he just seemed like a very, very kind gentleman. So obviously these are just a kind of glimpse of some of the many responses we have, and kindness often comes through in other aspects of our directives as well, on other topics. I like to think of our boxes of kindness, and that our material is imbued with kindness no matter the topic, but it also comes through particularly in our COVID collections. And over the course of the pandemic, we amassed about 10,000 narratives of people's lives through diaries and drawings and other responses to our directives that we issued during that time. And quite often kindness has come through as a theme, because I think people were more perhaps aware of kindness during that time. They were more aware of what they could do to be kind to their neighbours and friends. They were more aware of kind of acts of kindness that were being conducted. There was also the clap for carers in the NHS as well that people talked about. So some more opportunity to really express their experiences of kindness as well, and to share their lived experiences with mass observation. And I just particularly like this diary from a gentleman from May 2020, and he said, I'm a 67-year-old semi-retired teacher who now lives alone in central Exeter. I'm shielding until the end of June as my immune system is compromised after chemotherapy. I woke early on Tuesday to a sunny but cold day. I needed to post a birthday card to my brother in London. He'll be 80 and isn't looking forward to it. It's the first time since March the 18th that I've left the house to do something other than go to medical appointments. I feel like I'm doing something naughty as I walk up the street to the post box. I hope no one sees me. My neighbours have been so kind and shopping and generally caring for me that I'd rather not be seen out and about. I see Paul the postman looking happy. He says he's enjoying the empty streets of people in traffic. And I get home without being spotted as far as I know. And I just thought this was a terribly British response to his neighbour's kindness, that he was so worried about being seen out and about in case that undermines their kind of very act of being kind to him. And I also wondered whether or not it said something about the difficulties we have in accepting kindness or asking for help or acknowledging kindness and kind acts. So I thought that was a particularly interesting response. And we had lots of other examples through our COVID collections, people writing about the NHS, carers, particular experiences of loved ones, the care they received, the kindness they experienced. But also we had some other responses which showed that there were challenging times as well during COVID, particularly during the pandemic, where whilst there was lots of sort of explorations and showing of kindness, there were also things like here where the writer talks about the awful people who stripped all the supermarket shelves bare and were not kind at all. And people are also talking about the opportunity to be kinder to each other and to treat other people with respect, and perhaps also to focus on people who either have mental health issues or who are in prison, who need more kindness. And the writer here says, in other words, kindness breeds more kindness to ourselves, to our children, and to each other. And that made me think very much about the work that Mass Observation has done over the years, working with people in prison and people who are street homeless through our outreach programme. And one of my favourite quotes on kindness came from a prisoner a few years ago who wrote in his diary, "Why not be nice, kind and smile a lot?" And I thought about that as a really interesting connection to kindness in a place which is notoriously unkind and not a kind environment to be, and that active choice to be kind no matter the environment, the situation or the personal circumstances one finds ourselves in. And also the importance of listening to those whose voices are most often marginalised, which is one of the founding ethoses of mass observation, to give voice to those whose voices so often go unheard. And spending time with this material, it's really kind of shown me that the importance of finding kindness in the everyday, observing and sharing kindness with each other is so important, and celebrating kindness, however big or small the moment, wherever it can be found. which is why we've created our Everyday Kindness calendar. And I'm going to leave this and then go and chat to Michelle. But please do participate if you can. It's during this month of November, just in aid of World Kindness Day and celebration, really. And we decided to do a calendar, so it embeds everyday kindness, to both kindness to ourselves, to other people, and to the environment. And the idea being is you can just go on each square, there's a little kindness prompt, something for you to do, either for yourself or for someone else. And we're just encouraging people to take part. And we're hoping by the end of the month, kindness will become, just a habit, something we do that's embedded in our everyday. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides now, and then we can have a bit more of a chat. I'm aware I'm also plunged into darkness, so I'm going to see if I can pop a light on as well. And then I can see everybody, and hopefully you can see me. I don't know if that's any better. We're not all in the gloom. Okay. Right, that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of kindness in mass observation. Michelle.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Suzanne. I love that. It was so interesting. There were at least 10 different points that I've jotted down here that I wanted to bring up. But no, I actually want to start before we come to those. I wanted to start. I love the kindness calendar. That's great. And I hope everyone is filling it in. But I noticed that today was to say something kind someone had done for you this year. And I thought it might be quite a nice place to start with you, Suzanne. Have you filled that one in yet today? And what would it be for you? If you
know what, I was thinking about that one earlier, because I thought that's bound to come up. And if I'm going to mention it, I'm sure somebody will ask me. I was going to say it was a kindness from my boyfriend, actually. I was poorly, and I'd spent a really uncomfortable night downstairs, lying on the floor with a bad back. And I'd said, he offered to travel to come and see me to make sure if I was okay. And I said, no, I'll be fine. I was sort of comfy, and the boys had tucked me in, and I was cozy for the night. And the very next morning, he was knocking on the kitchen window, and he'd traveled down to see me just to make sure that I was okay. And I just thought that was such a lovely, kind gesture, and so thoughtful of him. He thought it wouldn't make him much of a boyfriend if he hadn't done that. It was just a natural, instinctive thing for him to do. But I thought I was overwhelmed, and I just thought that was such a lovely, kind and thoughtful thing. So that was the first thing that came to mind.
That's really lovely. And I think also what you've mentioned there is that idea of him thinking it wasn't much to do. And I think that's, and I'm sure everyone will agree, that was emerging out of all of those quotations there, that tension between whether you should be aware of your kindness or not aware of it. And I even jotted down a few words about that, because it was things like unsolicited, whether it's conscious, whether it's unconscious, and also this idea of being self-effacing. I don't know if you want to add anything about any of those.
Yeah, things. There were lots of people. I've got stacks of responses where people have sort of said that they've got that sort of sense of being quite a difficult thing, almost like if they're going to be kind, they don't want it to be acknowledged. That almost kind of undermines the very act of them being kind, and that genuinely kind people shouldn't seek any kind of acknowledgement, that the kindness in and of itself is enough reward in a way, and that almost that they're not altruistically being kind if it's acknowledged in some way. So there were some tensions there where people found real difficulties with kindness. And one gentleman who was in his 80s, he wrote he expressed quite strongly his views on kindness, and how that he felt that one of his friends of 60 years, he said, she lives alone, she goes to church, she takes time to be with old folks who are younger than she is. She takes them to appointments at the hospital, she sits and listens to them, and she makes them Christmas puddings, and she works at the church, and she does all of these sort of wonderful things. But he said, if you told her she was kind, she'd give you a very sharp answer indeed. Yes, he was very, very, and he also said that although he felt that he did behave kindly towards people, he felt that if anyone spoke about him at his funeral, referred to him as kind, he wouldn't be very happy with that at all. So he was kind of strident on the matter. And similarly, other people just, finding that kindness was something that they felt was quite a natural thing, and they didn't really want it to be made too much of it. They just wanted to kind of be kind, and that be it, and go about their day, really. So yeah, that did come through, definitely.
I know, because I think that can be something that's quite restrictive almost when you're thinking of being kind, because I think of what Ben said about blubbing earlier on, which I can't get out of my head now. But what I find is I travel a lot on public transport, and I like to be kind to people in kind of small ways on public transport, just because of having always traveled on public transport, including with young kids, and how difficult it is. So I always have one eye out to see if anyone needs a seat or whatever. But then when I actually do a kind act, I feel really embarrassed, and I often almost hesitate before doing the kind act, because I know I'm going to go red afterwards, and I'm going to struggle not to look smug, but I don't want to look smug. And so then you've got all these layers of additional troubling things around kindness that shouldn't be there at all, but they are. And often as I've got older, my eyes actually fill with tears when I do these kind acts, which is even worse, because then, you know, you think, I'm an insane person. So I think that's a real difficulty, isn't it? That kind of self-consciousness, which also came out of some of those quotes as well. About being defensive. People are so shy and awkward.
They are. And I had a similar experience actually on the train just recently, which just made me think of that when you were mentioning public transport. So it was half term. I was traveling to London with my teenage son to visit my older son, who's just moved up there to uni. And the train was packed. It was absolutely heaving. So we didn't get a seat. And my younger son currently has his arm in a massive cast. He broke his wrist and his arm just before half term. So he's in this massive cast. I'd bought us kind of hot chocolates and kind of croissants to have on the train journey. We didn't get a seat, so I was holding 2 drinks, so cakes. He had his arm. We were crammed into things, and it was really, really packed. And I noticed the sort of gentleman sort of catching my eye occasionally, and he was sort of looking down. And I just thought, well, it's a busy train. And then after a few stops had gone by, and it was clear we weren't going to get a seat anytime soon, he just sort of stood up and sort of proffered his seat to me. And I sort of said, oh no, don't worry, because I didn't want him to give up his seat, but at the same time, I was kind of conscious that, you know, it was a very packed carriage and everything else, and we were fine where we were really. But the lady next to him thought he was getting off, and her friend, who hadn't been able to get a seat, was further down the carriage. So she suddenly jumped up and called her friend over to take his seat. And then I was trying to explain to her, no, I think he was just offering me a seat out of kindness. Meanwhile, her friend was literally trying to climb in the seat that he hadn't yet vacated. And then it was this really awkward kind of comedy of errors almost, where we were all then terribly English about it all and all got really embarrassed. And then he stayed put in his seat, and then we got a seat later on. But it was just, it was this very awkward, and his well-meaning gesture was somehow kind of completely sort of appropriated by this woman who was then mortified. She was just so embarrassed, and it's just... Yeah.
That's the perfect play of kindness, isn't it? If we were going to develop something creative from this, it's a really compact, perfectly one. Yeah, that's brilliant. I'm wondering about what might stop people being kind. That seemed to emerge both from that aspect, but also you know, some of the people that were a bit more hostile towards acts of kindness too, and felt awkward around them.
Yeah, I think it came through that some people were thinking that kindness, you know, it shouldn't be a thing, you know, it should just be part of everyday life. So why are we having kindness days? I mean, what's that about? That sort of thing, that kind of attitude, where it's almost like, you know, well, everyone should be kind. That's sort of part of just, you know, human nature, as it were. So, you know, it wasn't that they were averse to being kind, they just didn't want to be made too much of it. There were a few writers, predominantly the male writers, who were sort of saying that they didn't really think about kindness. It wasn't something they were very conscious of. It wasn't something, until the directive had kind of, you know, hit their doormat, they hadn't really given much thought to, which I thought was quite interesting. And so then they were sort of struggling to find reference to moments of kindness in their life, or acknowledge kind of giving or receiving a kindness themselves, which was, it was quite interesting. I noticed that was predominantly from male respondees rather than the female respondees, who seemed to have no trouble writing reams and reams and reams about kindness and what it meant to them. But you know, obviously it's a very, very small sample, and emancipation is by no means representative. So but it was just interesting that more male response was a more aversion to kindness. I don't think I came across one female response where they were averse to kindness, or that they'd stopped being kindness. And I think the self-consciousness was mainly just kind of, they felt themselves as a kind person, they wanted to do kind deeds, but they didn't want to kind of be, you know, sort of overly sort of acknowledged for it in some way. Yeah.
That's so interesting. I think this, the gender aspect is really fascinating. There was two other things that I wanted to bring up, and then I think it'd be nice to open the floor to everyone. But I'm going to hog the situation while I've got my microphone off. But I think the gentleman who's very angry about the places can't be kind. I think it's really fascinating when you then mentioned the person in prison. Because I don't know if you actually use the term hostile environment, but the fact that you can have hostile places, and I think designers and architects are now thinking about that, aren't they? And the fact that the way that we create and lay out not just our properties, but also society more widely, you know, town planning and so on, thinking about hostile environments, you definitely do have places that are much more conducive to kindness, and prisons, of course, aren't one of those. So I think the idea, I hadn't thought about inanimate objects, but I think that's something really fascinating as well that I will now give thought to, because even things, I mean, trees aren't inanimate, but, you know, things that aren't human, that one does feel a sense of benign energy from. And I think that trees will be one of those, obviously crystals, rocks, candles, all these kind of things that we use to create a sense of warmth, comfort and kindness in our homes. I think that's, I don't know if you want to add anything about other people mentioning inanimate objects in their
inanimate
responses.
Objects. I don't know about inanimate. I mean, the place is almost interesting because by and large, as I mentioned, most people referred to people rather than places, or people within the places that they were associating. But some people did talk about places as in locations. So there was reference to Liverpool and Newcastle, which I thought was quite interesting. And having spent 3 years in Newcastle at university myself, I was really, taken by what people were saying about, you know, people of the north and the warmth that they found there. And I know my 3 years in Newcastle, probably the coldest place on earth, or the coldest place I've ever experienced, but the warmest people. So that was really, really interesting. And somebody also wrote about the beach being a place that she felt kindness from. I think, again, a sort of association with people, but the calmness of the beach, the fact that it was a constant, the fact that it was sort of changing in terms of the tide and the seascape, but that it was kind of bigger than her, and it kind of grounded her and made her feel calm, and then therefore she could sense kindness and kind of associate kindness there as a kind place. And I thought that was quite interesting as well. I'm trying to think if there are any other objects of kindness other than the origami, which I absolutely loved, which I thought was such a touching thing. But no others come to mind.
No, that's fantastic. And also what's made me realize is, bringing it all back to myself, is that I feel like that's about the moon, and I never thought about it. Yes. Yeah, because it's in the same way, it's always there. It kind of changes a little bit, but it's very, very constant. It's very beautiful. It always feels like a positive force. So that's given me something to think about. Feel even more loving towards the moon now and its kindness. But also sorry, go on.
No, I was just thinking the kindness of the moon. It was a full moon here last night, and I was just kind of looking up at it. That's a really lovely way to think of it. Yeah,
it is, isn't it? And the pull of the moon. Something that came to me as well, talking about a lot of people talking about their grandparents, and then that one respondent who mentioned her mother wasn't so kind. And something that troubles me about kindness is the way that it's only people who are comfortable themselves who are able to give kindness usually. And I was thinking, for the mother or the father, it's often quite difficult because you're so caught up in childcare, whereas for the grandparents it's easier to have that generosity of spirit. And I feel that if we had a wealthier society and a more equal society, there would be more kindness, if we're going to kind of take a strategic grand view of this. And I think that's something that's quite important, that does emerge often from those responses, because there was one woman, wasn't there, who said, I'm in a position to be able to be kind. And I think that really matters. And I think we're not all starting from the same point. Some people have more capacity for kindness, they have more time, they have more to give. And I think it's a really tricky one, because we do applaud people for kindness. And I think it must be very hard when you're in a really difficult position yourself and you can't give to other people, to also have that added layer of thinking, I'm not kind because I can't give to charity, I can't give my time to people. I think that's a slightly troubling aspect of kindness as well.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about the hostile environments earlier, I was kind of thinking back to my time kind of going into prison doing our outreach work, and obviously those environments aren't designed to be kind, and they're not necessarily imbued with kindness, but I certainly noticed that the value people placed on just small, kind, kindnesses, the kindness of listening to someone's story, the kindness of kind of taking time to be with them, the kindness of, having tea and biscuits together and things like that. Sort of this sort of everyday things that we may take for granted on the outside were kind of that much more kind within that environment. And that was something that I certainly focused on. And and I suppose it does make you appreciate, as I said to close, those sort of the everydayness of kindness is something that we need to kind of to value and to observe. And just by doing the calendar over the last sort of week or so, my colleagues have been doing it as well, that we sort of notice things more. And it's just that, to kind of observe, to notice, to kind of acknowledge, to share, just adds to its sort of power, I think, and to its impact on our daily lives, which I think can only be a good thing. And from what people were writing, particularly around their views around society, and there was quite a lot about climate change and politics and things, just this last few weeks, and in the news, it's utterly overwhelming. Obviously, we've got the war in Ukraine as well, and it's very, very easy to feel sort of overwhelmed with the unkindness of the world and the unkind acts that we hear so prevalently kind of in the news of the day and things like that. So it's, I think, where we can seek out the kindness, I think, wherever it be in the moon or wherever else we may find it, I think it's really, really important. So yes, shall we see if anyone else wants to share anything?
I think that would be
great. Thanks, Abby. That's great. I hope your foot heals soon. Abby's just had to go, but if anyone else has got any, I'm just going to quickly check the chat and see if there are any other comments in the chat as well. Ben, did we make you cry? Are you okay?
I am okay. I thought Michelle's thing about that, imagining yourself doing an act of kindness and almost being sentimental about you doing it. It's very funny. I share that. I was thinking about, primary schools. We teach kindness, kind acts are absolutely, things we're going to have to learn. And along with that is sharing. And then this is in preparation for a society where wealth isn't shared at all, resources are hoarded like mad. It just, it is a crazy world, isn't it?
I think it is, and I think that's where I noticed people were kind of sort of personalizing these acts of kindness, these small things that they could do in their own individual lives in a way of kind of just kind of keeping that kind of kindness kind of community around them and their families or their neighbors or their streets, whatever it may be, just to try and insulate themselves perhaps from the craziness of the world out there and the impact of unkindness. Did anyone else have any questions? Thanks, Lindsay. I'm aware we're almost out of time, so if anyone has any questions for Michelle or myself, or okay. Yes, Frances.
I've just started to think, as a result of what you're saying, about whether there might be a connection between kindness and gratitude on behalf of the giver of the kindness, and wondering whether that comes down to whether you as the kindness giver feel well resourced or not. And I have noticed with some of the difficulties of the past few years, there are times where I feel like my back's against the wall, and I feel like I've not been as kind and as giving to the world as I might have liked to have thought that I was, because there's been a sort of feeling of it's at times of you've got to look out for yourself and yours, the people who are immediately around you, and that for me was really quite a surprising feel, because I've had quite an international upbringing, and I've never had this a particular feeling of you know, looking after yours and your kind before other people, but it's introduced me to that way of thinking, which has been quite disturbing.
Yeah, I, if you don't mind me coming in, Susanna, that was what I was kind of meaning with the tensions, because I think it is hard, and also I think with pain, I think when one's in pain, it's almost impossible to be kind. It makes you incredibly irritable because you're in so much discomfort, and I think that's a tough thing. And I think that pressure to be kind is almost adds another layer of stress for people when they're already struggling. And I think so it's maybe you need to be kind to yourself in terms of kindness as well. It's like a double impact there, so that you don't feel you have to be kind at all times, because there's another pressure, isn't there? Sorry, Susanna, I couldn't help but jump in.
No, absolutely. And I was going to say similarly, I think you have to be, you know, we have to be kind to ourselves, because that's the well from everything will spring from. So, you know, we can only be kinder to others and those around us if we're firstly kind to ourselves. So I think that's really, really important. And that's why our kindness calendar has sort of aspects for ourselves as well as for others and for the environment too. I think it's just a kind of, more of a holistic kind of approach. But do, look after yourself. It's really important. We were going to do the kind words exercise, weren't we, just to close, to see if there are any other words that spring to mind. Should we do that quickly in the chat before we finish? But I wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone for coming, and I hope you have a wonderful World Kindness Day this weekend, whatever you are doing on that day. Please do follow Mass Observation. We've got the kindness calendar. Ella, my colleague, is making little films every day on Instagram and Twitter, if you've got access to those. And they're really lovely kind of little moments just to, yesterday was opening the door for someone, and Ella realised she was filming at home and she only had her miniature sausage dog for company. So she opened the door for Alfie. So there's a lovely little video on our Instagram of her opening the door and little Alfie kind of sort of tottering through. So for that alone, that's a lovely moment. But thank you very much for coming along to the session. If you want to pop some kind words in the chat to close, compassion, that's lovely. Thank you. Forgiveness. Thanks, Ben. That's great. Let's see if I can. Caring. Let's see if I can put one.
Holding the door open for someone is where kindness can go really wrong. If they're slightly too far away and they're quite kind of old, and they feel they have to kind of run to, otherwise you're waiting there for too long.
That's a good point.
That's lovely.
Suzanne, can I ask, are you currently recruiting?
We are recruiting observers. So yes, I didn't get my plug in earlier, so thank you. Yes, we are. So if you're interested in writing Mass Observation, just get in touch. There's a link on our website and you can get in touch with us, and we are actively recruiting new writers.
Well, actually, I was going to suggest it to my mum, who might
Fantastic.
your age range a bit.
Absolutely, everyone's welcome. We are actively recruiting, so if she may be interested in writing for us, please do get in touch.
Thank you.
Oh, Jane, that's lovely. And chat, I like that. Growthful.
Oh, expansive, growthful, reassuring, hopeful. Those are lovely words. Thank you. We'll make sure we've got all of these recorded. And this recording will go on to, once we've edited it, will go on to the YouTube channel for Mass Observation as well. So there'll be reference if you wanted to watch it back at any time or share it with anybody, it'll be on there. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Michelle, for all of your really interesting, insightful questions. I will never look at the moon again in the same way.
Nor will I. I discovered it today during this call. I had no idea. But no, thank you, Suzanne. That was really wonderful, really uplifting, and so much to think about.
Thank you.